continue now at the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis in Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 3b. The Gemara in the previous Amud had quoted a Mishnah in Peah, which said, let's say a Balabayas piles up his godish, piles up his pile of grain together, and it gets mixed up with leket. So the Chachamim make a knas that the whole thing has to be considered leket. The Aniyim can collect from the whole thing. And Rav Ami says, B'Shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rav Ami says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, to Beis Shammai, that this Mishnah has to be, it follows Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai's position is that if you have hefker la'aniyim, that's considered hefker. In other words, let's say I make something hefker only to aniyim and not to ashirim, that's still considered hefker, and that's what's happening over here. The Chachamim are saying to the Balabayas, you have to make it hefker la'aniyim. Everything that you got mixed up there with the leket is now hefker la'aniyim. The Ika Beis Hillel, because if it was following Beis Hillel, that hefker la'aniyim is not considered hefker, so aniyim ochlim ma'asrin, it would come out that the aniyim would be allowed to eat the food, but they would have to take off meiser. Why would they have to take off meiser? Because hefker la'aniyim really isn't hefker. It's not a real kind of hefker. So even if the Chachamim made a knas and told the guy you have to be mafker all to aniyim, it's not going to be real hefker. V'omar le Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi responded to Rabbi Ami in the name of Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Shamanu shu pater mi meiser. No, we have heard that it is pater from meiser divrei hakol, according to everyone, even according to Beis Hillel, mishum knasu, because of the knas. And the idea is that if you're going to say it follows even the position of Beis Hillel, so then it means that the Rabbanan made a knas and they used hefker bez and hefker to make it hefker to aniyim, only to aniyim, but they used hefker bez and hefker, and that shows that when you use hefker bez and hefker, it can make it pater even from meisers, which was the original question of the Gemara. Does hefker bez and hefker have the ability to pater from meisers? And that will be the answer to that question. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, B'chamisha asur bo, on the 15th of Adar again, Shulchanos hayu yoshvin b'Medina. The money changers would sit in the Medina. They would sit within the country. The idea is they would be available so that people could change their money so they could have a machatzis hashekel. B'chafei, now by the 25th of Adar, yashvu b'mikdash. At that point, they already sat in the mikdash. Some people say the mikdash means specifically Yerushalayim, but the idea is they sat closer because they wanted to get people to hurry up so that people would realize time is running out. We need to give in the machatzis hashekel. Mishayashvu b'mikdash hischilu l'mashkin. Now, from that point in time, from when the money changers sat in the mikdash, that's also when they began to take mashkin from people who did not yet give machatzis hashekel. They would take a collateral. Basically, they would start collecting, forcing them to give. As mimim mashkin. Now, who did they take mashkin from? Who did they force to give the machatzis hashekel? The answer is Leviim, v'Yisraelim, Levis, Yisraels, v'Geirim, and converts, v'Avodim, v'Shechrarim, slaves that were freed. Avolo noshav v'Avodim u'katanim. But not women, not people who are still avodim, not katanim. They're not chayiv machatzis hashekel, so they were mashkin them. V'chol katan shehischil aviv lishkol al yado shuveino posek. Now, any katan who the father began to give machatzis hashekel on his behalf, so that we don't discontinue it, we continue to give the machatzis hashekel. Now, katanim over here generally is understood to mean that it's less than 20 years old. At 20 years old, that's when the chiv of machatzis hashekel kicks in. And the Mishnah continues, Ein memashkin es hakohanim mimnei darchei shalom. The Mishnah says, we are not memashkin the kohanim as darchei shalom. In other words, this part of the Mishnah is saying, even though kohanim really are chayiv in machatzis hashekel, it's not nice that we should force them and collect from them, so we don't do it. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Hayed ben Bukhri b'Yavna. Ben Bukhri testified in Yavna, Kol kohen sheshokel eino chote. He said a kohen that gives machatzis hashekel is not a sinner. Meaning you'd have a havamina that if a kohen gives machatzis hashekel, that's actually the wrong thing to do. We'll see why in a minute. But it's not true, he said. It's not a sin. It's okay for the kohen to give machatzis hashekel. Now that implies that a kohen is not obligated to give machatzis hashekel. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, Lo, no, you got it wrong. Ki alakol kohen she'eno shokel chote. On the contrary, if a kohen does not give machatzis hashekel, it is a sin. It's actually an obligation for the kohen to give machatzis hashekel. Elisha kohanim darshan mikras aliyatzman. Except that the kohanim, they darshan the following pasuk to their benefit incorrectly. They think that there's a pasuk that says that they don't need to give machatzis hashekel. What does the pasuk say? Pasuk says, "V'chol minchas kohen kolel tia lo sochal." It says that if you have a carbon mincha that belongs to a kohen, halach is you can't eat it. So they think if we start giving machatzis hashekel, then the public carbon minchas will be considered minchas kohen, but we eat those public carbon minchas, so that's a problem. So we don't want to participate in machatzis hashekel because then every public carbon mincha is going to be a minchas kohen. Hoel ve'omer shtei alechem v'lechem aponim shalanu heich necholin. They reasoned if the carbon omer, if the shtei alechem, if the lechem aponim, all of these are considered carbon mincha. If all of these things are going to be from us because we're participating in machas hashekel and they're public, so then how are they eaten? But they are eaten. So they darshan that pasuk to try to say that they don't have to give machas hashekel. But again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying that's not true. They are obligated to give machas hashekel. That's an incorrect drasha, because if it's public and there's just a minority of kohanim, that's not considered to be a minchas kohen. The Gemara says, "Ein memashkin es hakatanim." Again, quoting the Mishnah, we're not memashkin the katanim, meaning we don't collect from katanim the machas hashekel. We don't force them to pay because they're not chayiv. So the Gemara says, "Holitzvo atovin." So apparently, we're not memashkin them. We don't collect from them. We don't force a collection, but we do ask them to donate the machas hashekel. And the Gemara explains that's if the katan is actually really an adult. In other words, somebody who has 2 hairs but he's not yet 20 years old, that individual, we would ask him to give machas hashekel, but we're not going to be memashkin. Avalim lo hevi beisaris lo bida. But if he doesn't even have beisaris, if you're dealing with an actual katan, an actual minor, then we don't even ask that they give the machas hashekel. There's no chiyuv whatsoever. In other words, pashup pshat is, once they reach adulthood, they're chayiv on a drabanan level, but we're not going to be memashkin, we're not going to force a collection. But once they reach 20, that's when we start forcing. Well, memashkin ain't memashkinin, but when it comes to forcing the collection again, we're not going to do it afal pi shehevi beisaris, even though they have 2 hairs, because they're not yet 20 years old. Only when they reach 20 years old are we memashkin. The Gemara now addresses the next part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that we're not memashkin kohanim because of darchei shalom. So the Gemara says, Kini masnisin ein memashkinin es hakohanim b'mnei derech hakavod. You should understand that the Mishnah means we're not memashkin kohanim because of derech hakavod, meaning it's not kavod to start forcing the kohanim to pay machas hashekel, because they're already doing so much service in the Beis HaMikdash. So even if they're chayiv in machas hashekel, we wouldn't be memashkin them. That's not a proper kavod. The Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Heyed v'chulu. Again, we have machlokus there, whether kohanim at all are chayiv in machas hashekel. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Birchia says, time with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The reasoning of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai why he says kohanim are chayiv to give machas hashekel, because it says zeh yitnu, and it means to say yud beis shvatim yitnu. The word zeh, zayin plus hey, 7 plus 5 is 12. It's a hint of the fact that yud beis shvatim, all 12 shvatim have to give machas hashekel. That's the source. Rav Tavi b'shem Rav Hamnuna kain meshiven chachamim l'Rav Yehuda. Now Rav Tavi says in the name of Rav Hamnuna that the following is how the chachamim respond to Rav Yehuda, because the halacha is chatos yachid mesa and ein chatos tzibur mesa. The halacha is a chatos that's brought by an individual. So let's say you lose that carbon chatos, you replace it with a different animal, it has to die. But that's not true by a chatos of a carbon tzibur. So you see that a chatos yachid and a chatos tzibur are different. So in the same fashion, minchas hayachid kareva kolil. If you have a carbon mincha of an individual kohen, that's going to be completely burned. V'yein minchas hatzibur kreva kolel. That's not going to be true by a minchas tzibur, by a public carbon mincha. So therefore, there's no problem with the kohanim joining in the machas hashekel, because that's a public carbon mincha. Doesn't have any problem eating such a carbon. It's not going to be kolel anyway. And the Gemara says, "V'kasha meshivin lo adam davar sheino modebo." The truth is that question the Chacham after Rabbi Yehuda is difficult, because do you answer somebody with something that he doesn't even admit to? T'tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, Shein chatos tzibur mesa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Thomas. It's only the position of the Tanna Kama that a chatos tzibur isn't left to die in a situation where again you lose it and you replace it. But Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says Thomas, it should die. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't even agree with their premise that they're using to argue their point. So that's a strange thing the Gemara is saying, to use an argument against Rabbi Yehuda that he doesn't even really agree with. And now this next line, many of the Rishonim changed the girsa to v'inun mosivin lei. The Chachamim, again, they ask on Rabbi Yehuda the following question. Zu lo nidvas yachidi? Isn't this a problem in your position? Because Rabbi Yehuda's position is, Kohanim are not chayiv in machas hashekel, but if they want to give, they can give. But isn't that a problem? Because that's just a nidvas yachid. That's just a donation of an individual. If they're not chayiv in machas hashekel, their money shouldn't be part of the money of the tzibur that makes it a carbon tzibur. V'in masivin lei, so he responds to them. Again, you have to change the gear so that he's responding to them. Kevon shenimsru l'tzibur, since it's given to the tzibur, since they're donating it to the tzibur, kimishu nidvas tzibur. It's considered like a nidvas tzibur. Gemara now says, Ksiv kol ha'over al ha'pekudim. Pasuk says, who's chayiv in machas hashekel? Anyone who's over al ha'pekudim. So there's a machlokas amoraim. What does this mean exactly? Rabbi Yehuda Reb Nechemia, it's a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Nechemia. Chad Omar called the Avar biyama yitain. One says over al pekudim refers to anyone who went through the Yamsuf has to give machas hashekel. Basically means everybody, including Kohanim, including Levim, etc. V'charno Omar, the other opinion says called the Avar al pikudaya yitain. Anyone who's counted together with the rest of Klal Yisrael. We know that the Kohanim, the Levim, were counted separately, so they're not included in the chiyuv of machas hashekel. Man Domer called over biyama yitin Messiah Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The one who says anyone who crossed the Yamsuf, that would be like the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Kohanim are obligated. Man Domer called over al pikudaya yitin Messiah ben Bukhri. The one who says anybody who's counted together with Klal Yisrael, that would be a support of ben Bukhri, that the Kohanim are not included in the chiyuv. The Gemara continues with the Mishnah. Afal pi shamroin memashkin in noshim va'avadim ukatanim. Even though we say that we don't force collection of the machas hashekel from women, from servants, and from minors, avolim shakl mekavlin miyadin. But in all these cases, if they want to give machas hashekel, we can accept it from them. However, the Mishnah says, Hanachri v'hakusi, when it comes to the non-Jew, and when it comes to the kusi, sheshaklu, if they give shkalim, ein mekavlin mehen, we don't accept it from them. V'ein mekavlin miyadam kinei zavin v'kinei zavos v'kinei yoldos v'chatos v'hashamos. Furthermore, we don't accept from them, let's say they have a donation of the birds that are used for the carbon of a zav or zava, or for a yoleda, someone who gives birth, or carbon chatas, carbon asham, all of those things, we don't accept those donations from the nachri and the kusi. And zeh haklal, the rule is as follows: kol shenidor v'nidav mekavlin miyadam. Anything that is able to be given as a neder or nedava, basically a carbon ola or carbon shlamim, which non-Jews are allowed to donate, a carbon ola, carbon shlamim, they're allowed to be nodrin v'nodvin ki Yisrael in those situations, that we accept from them. But kol she'eno nidor v'nidav, anything that cannot be given as a donation, as a neder or nedava, that goes on the mizbeach, ein mekavlin miyadin, we don't accept it from them, so that applies again to carbon chatos, carbon asham, and similarly, bedek habayis. Let's say the non-Jew would want to make a donation just for bedek habayis purposes of the Beis HaMikdash. In order to fix up the Beis HaMikdash, we would not accept it from them. V'chein mefurash al yedei Ezra, that's also explained through Ezra, shenemar, like the pasuk says, lo lachem v'lonu livnos bayis lelokeinu. It's not for you and us to build. We're not going to accept from the non-Jews to help us build the Beis HaMikdash, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Dalid Amud Aleph.